See? Okay. Yeah, so if you really want to set up, okay, you actually start.
But should I just go ahead and speak in English?
Okay. Thank you all for being here. It's wonderful to see have talks in the auditorium again. I feel like I'm still extra excited when we do things on site. So thank you for being here. It is an honor and a pleasure to have Karen Hall here with us today, restoration ecologist from University of California, Santa Cruz, who has worked extensively for a few years in Costa Rica. And thank you for all the research that you do and seeking applications for that research. I'm really excited to learn about how your research can inform what are very important large-scale efforts at growing trees, which we need to do in the best way possible. So thank you, Karen, for being here. Gracias a Karen por estar aquí. Es ecóloga de restauración de la Universidad de California en Santa Cruz y es investigadora y busca siempre aplicaciones de los resultados de sus investigaciones. Por ejemplo, en la charla de hoy nos va a contar sobre cómo podemos aplicar esas lecciones para mejorar estos esfuerzos masivos de siembra de árboles. Muchas gracias, Karen.
You? No, I'm not talking about my research. Okay, I just want to make sure. Okay. So great to be here today. I just before I start, I'll talk a little bit about who I am and what I do. I'm a restoration ecologist, and broadly, and how to restore damaged ecosystems. And this is my book, so Primer of Ecological Restoration. I'm really proud. This year, the Spanish and the Portuguese translations were made available online, open access. So if people are interested in sort of restoration broadly, and particularly in Latin America. I do have a long-term project in southern Costa Rica. I work near San Vito, in a very similar kind of elevation as here, on a large-scale forest restoration project that has now been running for 19 years. I just came back from doing field work there. Miguel Chavez worked with me on the project for a number of years. I'm not going to talk specifically about that project today. If at the end we have time, I'd be happy to talk about the results of that work. I also work a lot in other Latin American countries, but primarily with collaborators in those countries. This is Pedro Brancaleon, who in Brazil, who works in the Atlantic Forest, who's done a lot of work on forest restoration projects there. And he also is my main collaborator on this large-scale tree planting initiative work. This is one of my former grad students, Alicia Calle, who works in Colombia, and I've had other students who worked in Mexico and Panama. And in addition, I do research in California, where I work some on forest restoration, but also a lot on grassland restoration in the Santa Cruz area where I live. But today I'll talk about these large-scale global tree planting initiatives, which is something I've been involved in a lot in giving advice in the last 3 years. Again, just working with my collaborator, Pedro Brancaleon in Brazil, and then more recently, my postdoc, Spencer Schubert, and a number of other collaborators. So there are huge restoration initiatives globally. The Bond Challenge aims to restore 350 million hectares globally by 2030. That's an area the size of India. We're currently in the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, which is across all ecosystems. Bond Challenge is just forests. There's also at least 3 trillion tree planting campaigns globally. One by the World Economic Forum, Plant for the Planet, and then some conservation organizations. And you pretty much can't go on your computer without being asked to click on a tree planting, to plant a tree. So the question is, where did this tree planting obsession come from? I think it's fairly straightforward. We get bad news about the environment every day, on all biodiversity, climate change. And so trees and tree planting have been promoted as this universal solution that we can get, that we have mind-blowing potential to change for climate. We're also going to get biodiversity, and we're going to help people to help people's well-being. In 2019, a big paper came out in Science in which a group from Switzerland said that we could plant our way out of climate change. And so there was already this fervor for tree planting, but now it's just, we're gonna save the climate, and we're gonna do it this way. There's also been a huge amount of critique of that, and I have been amongst those people. Pedro and I wrote a response in 2020 where we talked about the fact that tree planting is not really a simple solution to these complex problems. And so what do we mean by that? Well, tree planting can achieve a lot of things. First of all, it can, it can improve, well, I'm not sure if the batteries, okay, I'll just find it. Okay, so it can increase carbon and water storage, can increase landscape connectivity, can also increase stakeholder engagement and enhancement of livelihoods. However, there's also a number of potential negative effects of tree planting. In arid systems where there aren't a lot of trees when they're planted, they've demonstrated that it can reduce water supply. It's also there's some tree planting that goes into what are ancient grasslands, so it's destroying native ecosystems. In certain cases, trees are planted that are invasive, spread, and it's also caused social conflicts in some places. And in the worst case scenario, if trees are planted in lands that are being used by people for agriculture, it gets displaced and then they go clear forest elsewhere. So you have a net loss of forest. And so there's quite a number of examples of tree planting failures. There's some really highly publicized ones where there's actually been social conflict where people are not supportive of the tree planting and they get ripped out. In other cases, the trees just fail because they didn't plant the right species, they didn't maintain the trees. And so a lot of money is invested and then it's wasted. Another example, and this is a senior thesis student of mine at UC Santa Cruz who actually was just here on the EAP program, Monteverde. Ethiopia garnered a lot of press, like they set a world record campaign of planting 350 million trees in a day. And Thaddeus Mem was of Ethiopian origin, so he wanted to go look at heritage, and he wanted to go look at what was going on. And what he found during his trip to Ethiopia and actually talking to a lot of government officials, they don't necessarily know where the trees were planted. They say that they planted 300 million trees, they don't know if they've survived. They have almost no data. And in some cases, he found that what they would be doing to get their numbers of this big initiative of the government is they would go out and plant trees. They would die, and then the next year they just go replant in the same area, and they just keep counting the number of trees that you keep planting. And so there's not a lot of net gain. And then he went through and sort of came up with, sorry, the slide's not quite large enough, but talked about how this top-down program from the Prime Minister's office really needs to be better connected with local communities and NGOs for them to achieve what they want to achieve. So I like to make clear that I'm not saying that tree planting is a bad thing. I'm a restoration ecologist. I've spent my life doing a lot of forest restoration and other ecosystems. But I like to change the narrative from tree planting to tree growing, and that we really need to do it the right way, and we need the right planning if we're going to succeed in what we want to get over time. And so the reason I call it tree growing is because you can plant trees, and there's a lot of fixation in these global commitments on how many trees have we planted, but that doesn't necessarily mean that these trees survive. The other thing is there's a lot of trees that establish that aren't planted, as you know. If you work in ecology, a lot of them just regenerate naturally, and so it's not just about planting trees. And these tree planting efforts are part of a number of different natural climate solutions in the broader literature, such as different types of wetland restoration, agroforestry, and grazing management globally, but I'll just be focusing on the forest and the tree part of it today. So since my paper in Science in 2020, I've gotten called by a lot of reporters, and when I talk to them, there's sort of a couple of different things that I say. The first one is that tree growing and other natural climate solutions are not a substitute for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And this is one of the big concerns, is that people see that, okay, we can just continue to commit our greenhouse gas emissions and we can plant trees and solve it. And when you look at this, just from Organization One Earth, land restoration is one of the pieces of the solution, one of the pieces of the puzzle, but we're not going to plant our way out of climate change. The second thing that, and one of the reasons we're not going to do that is in addition to the fact that there really isn't enough land, is that we're taking carbon from geologic carbon and we're putting it in trees, which are pretty, they're not really permanent. And so we see this like in California where there's lots of areas where there's trees, but they're going up in fire or there are insect outbreaks. And so this carbon that goes into trees, it's by no means that it's guaranteed that it's going to stay there. The second thing I say is that the first thing we need to be doing is protecting the existing forest. And I'm sure everybody in this audience knows that, but even as a restoration ecologist, I will be the first to say that we're never going to recreate the forest where it was. We do the best we can, but we really need to protect our existing forests, and that way we don't have this time lag of the recovery time. And so it's really key because there's so many proposals to go out and plant trees that the same people are not protecting forests. So that means addressing the drivers of deforestation, which in tropical forests are largely different agricultural products, and thinking about, reducing our consumption of beef, how we produce things like oil palm and soy, and where are we going to get those, and really thinking about supply chains and where we get those from. But it also means making sure that any sort of incentives for tree planting are well founded. And one of the most egregious concerns about deforestation is an example from Mexico, where they were paying farmers to plant trees, and what the farmers were doing was going and clearing the forest and then planting trees in the cleared forest. And so if these programs, incentive programs, are not designed well, those are sort of some of the perverse incentives that come up. So in thinking about these tree growing campaigns, it's really thinking about how are we going to, where are we going, why are we growing trees, where does it make the most sense to grow them, and how to do it makes the most sense. So why do we plant trees? Well, people plant trees for a lot of different reasons. To sequester carbon is a big one right now, to prevent erosion and accelerate recovery of fires is big where I live in California, conserving biodiversity and forest restoration, and I know there's a lot of that around here. There's a lot of urban tree planting, providing shade and increasing green space. Other people are planting trees to practice agroforestry, or planting trees for timber and wood products, which is also really important because we need to provide those trees. So there's a lot of different reasons. And one of the problems with these tree planting campaigns is that they're promising a whole bunch of things from the same planting projects, but there are trade-offs. And there was an interesting paper about 2 years ago by Meredith Martin, and what they showed is actually the vast majority of tree planting that's going on is not for biodiversity or for carbon. It's actually much more utilitarian. It's for these reasons of wood products and agroforestry. More and more it's for carbon. But it's really important to think about that there are trade-offs, and so it's important to know why we're planting trees in the first place. So as an example of that, this is an example from a 2020 paper, my second 2020 paper with Pedro Brancaleone. This is from Brazil. There's a lot of reforestation work being done in the Brazilian Atlantic forest. And so if you look at, I know it's a little bit small on the screen, but if you look at why they're planting, well, partly they're planting for carbon sequestration as part of their nationally defined climate, their commitments for carbon. Then some of their funding comes from organizations that are also concerned about biodiversity at the global scale. At the national level, the Brazilian government does have a forest law. It's largely focused on water quality and water quality prevention. So there's a different goal there. But the people who are actually doing the planting are the local farmers. And what the local farmers usually want to plant are species that produce fruits, that produce timber. And those may or may not be the species that maximize biodiversity or that maximize carbon. And so one of the biggest things I talk to when I'm talking to groups that are doing tree planting is, why do you want to do it? And you really have to be clear about the why to figure out how you're going to be going about doing this tree planting or forest restoration if that's your goal of tree planting. What they've done in Brazil is they have the Atlantic Forest Pact, which is a group of over 270 different organizations from academia, in the restoration field, with the government, NGOs, and they've all worked together quite a bit to come up with a plan where they have developed methodologies, monitoring schemes. They've also sort of across the landscape have chosen different goals so that they balance those across the landscape. And I think that's what we need is more regional planning so that we sort of think about how do we achieve these multiple goals, but probably not always in the same reforestation projects. So in our sort of longer 2020 paper, Pedro and I talk a lot about, how we could be doing this tree planting better. And so, again, clearly defining and agreeing on project goals among stakeholders, integrating decision-making across scales, and really going through a thorough planning process to tailor tree growing strategies so that we improve the actual outcomes of the process. And the first thing is thinking about, what is the most appropriate strategy for growing trees, and whether we need to plant trees at all. So we know that one of the forest recovers naturally, and here in the tropics that we have a lot of seed dispersal, there's also a lot of wind dispersal, and it's a lot of regenerating naturally. And so we have these cases like this. This is from the Yucatan Peninsula where one of my former graduate students worked. And after 3 years, because they haven't been really intensively used for agriculture and there's a lot of wind dispersed species, you see a huge amount of regeneration. So we probably don't even need to be planting trees. In other cases, and this is in California following the fires near my house, where there's a lot of resprouting too. And so when people ask me, do we need to be replanting? Well, no, we can let the ecosystem just recover on its own. But obviously in other cases, like pastures around here, really heavily degraded lands, you have to take a different strategy. So there's sort of a continuum of tree growing approaches from natural regeneration to assisted natural regeneration, where the trees establish on their own, but then you do things like clear around the seedlings that establish to help them grow faster, or prevent fire from burning them down. One of the most common restoration strategies is mixed native tree species planting, agroforestry if that's the goal of the project, or in some cases monoculture tree plantations may make sense. For me as a restoration ecologist, it's not what I would choose, but we obviously need to provide our wood from somewhere. And so the message is, the most appropriate strategy for planting or for growing trees depends on the local ecological and social conditions and the project goals. So along with that, the other parts of the planning process is thinking about, is the land tenure secure, and how will landowners be compensated for lost income? And this is a big issue because a lot of the tree planting failures that have happened have nothing to do with ecological reasons. It has to do with social reasons, and that people don't maintain the seedlings, that they don't protect them. And if the local stakeholders aren't bought into it, then the trees aren't going to last at the time period we need for the forest to regenerate. There's also the questions of who will pay for the cost to fence the land, to grow the trees, and to monitor the trees, and who will protect the sites. And so, there's a lot of these tree planting efforts where they say for $1 a tree we can plant a tree. Well, you can probably plant a tree for $1 in some cases, but whether you can actually grow a tree over the time period and maintain it, it costs a lot more money to do all the rest of these things. So another big message is that you really need to be planning for permanence, and so scaling up what I would say is the quality, not just the quantity. And so rather than say having a goal of 1 trillion trees, which is what a bunch of these campaigns do, is thinking about I'd rather see something like 200 billion trees that are alive in 10 or 20 years, because that's really for us to get the benefits we need these longer term commitments. And this is a real concern because despite all the massive tree planting that's going on, we know that many places in Latin America, this is data from 2015 to 2020, that despite the tree planting, these red zones here, a lot of the net forest is still being lost in these areas. There are very few places, there are some places more in Europe and China where the tree cover is actually going up. And what we've seen, there was a series of articles, the first of which was by a former graduate student of mine in southern Costa Rica, and then it came showing that a lot of the forest that looks like they're secondary forest and regrowing get re-cleared over time. And then the same analysis was done across Latin America and then globally, showing that a lot of this area that we think is being reforested is actually being re-cleared. And this is a huge issue because then we think we're getting carbon, we think we're getting biodiversity, and we're really not. So we need to be thinking about, again, stakeholder engagement, selecting species that are likely to survive in future climates, this question of funding, maintenance, and monitoring and adaptive management over time to keep them there, and also probably thinking about selecting lands that are less productive for agriculture, because farmers aren't going to have a lot of, or landowners aren't going to have a lot of initiative to keep trees growing in areas that are, that have a lot of other economic values. And so this is one of the focuses of my colleague, Freire Bracaleone, is really looking at different land uses in Brazil and figuring out which ones probably we're going to be doing reforestation on the lands that are less agriculturally valuable, but over the long term that those are more likely to be maintained. And so this type of planning, one of the better examples of this that I've seen is some work by Susan Cook Patton. This is actually in the United States. And she worked for the Nature Conservancy, and they were looking at what's the best places to do this large-scale reforestation. And so they did these analysis. Well, protected areas make sense because of the lands that have long-term protection. Maybe in post-burn fire places that are in pastures that have low agricultural productivity, where you have challenging soil conditions, or areas that are frequently flooded. And so really looking at places that might work. And what they did was then, that I thought was really good, was they actually talked to practitioners about the feasibility and costs, and what they come up with is this ranking system to realize that where it makes most sense to plant and for long-term reforestation really depends a lot on, and this is the United States, but on where you are and which lands are the least productive for economic uses. It also means coming up with sort of win-win solutions for landowners. And this is some work that my former graduate student Lisa Kaya did in Columbia. They're doing a lot of work with silvopastoral systems. And those are systems where you are grazing, but within the grazing lands, you're planting nitrogen-fixing shrubs, you're planting trees, and you're increasing both the productivity of the land for cattle, but also increasing the biodiversity value of the land. So the idea of those lands is that if you increase the productivity in some of the productive lands, and plant trees there, you increase the value of them. But you also then remove the more the sort of sensitive lands and steep slopes out of production. And what she found was that farmers who received payments to transition over to these silvopastoral systems actually did increase the forest cover over a 10-year period a lot more than the farmers who didn't get those types of payments. But it's sort of a win-win because the farmers are continuing to produce cattle on their land, but they're also increasing the biodiversity value at the same time. I'll let you catch up. Okay. So as I mentioned, since I have my 2020 paper, I have gotten contacted by a lot of reporters from about over 30 different media outlets and pretty big name ones too, that want to know, because there's this huge bandwagon of we want to plant trees, and they want me to tell them that we can plant to fight climate change, which I won't do. And then when I get quoted in those, then I get called by conservation organizations, and both sort of conservation organizations and also various investors who are trying to invest in the carbon market. And the big question that I get asked by all these people is, which tree growing programs should I support? Because there's so many different ones out there to choose from. And so this has led to this additional research that I've been working on, which I 3 years ago had not really planned on, which is thinking about, which organizations should be supported. And so in 2022, Pedro and I came up with this list of questions, and I won't go through all these questions because they're pretty much what I've been telling you for the last half an hour about, thinking about what are your goals, what strategies are you using, how will the stakeholders be engaged, what are the potential negative consequences. We were also really interested in how are outcomes being monitored, because there's not a lot of monitoring data, and how is that used to guide adaptive management. And in the process of doing this, what we realized was that there's kind of two types of organizations. There's probably more than this, but they're what we call our intermediary organizations, and those tend to be NGOs that are usually based in the global north, and they're raising a lot of the funding and then passing it to the organizations on the ground, which are based both throughout the world, to actually do the tree growing. And so these are groups like Conservation International or Plant for the Planet or One Tree Planted. There's a whole bunch of them. And then they give their money to implementing organizations, which tend to be more local organizations that actually do the work on the ground. And so we've been looking more at these intermediary organizations and really looking at, how much do we know about these organizations and how successful have they been in the past? And also, how is the funding allocated and how much is going to these intermediary organizations versus how many is actually going to the groups on the ground who are doing the actual work? So over the last year or so, this is work that I've been doing with Spencer Schubert, who's a postdoc with me, Christina Boveda is a graduate student, and then several other undergraduates who worked on the project. And what we did between January and March of this year was that we went through the web pages of 99 intermediary organizations. That's 99 of these organizations. And these are, the reason we focus on them and not the implementing organizations is because there are thousands of them. And it would almost be impossible to follow up on those organizations because any given intermediary organization may support anywhere between tens to hundreds of on-the-ground implementing organizations. And what we did was look at how well they share information that answers these questions. And that approach is limited somewhat because it's only the publicly available information. Certainly we would have gotten more information if we'd gone and interviewed every one of these organizations. But that was a lot more work, and we also feel like there's a public accountability factor that, people and donors need to know, like if I'm going to give my money to doing planting projects, you need to know how well these organizations are doing. So what did we find? There's been a huge, over this time, there's been a huge amount of growth in the last 20 years. A lot of these organizations are relatively recent. They vary a lot in how much experience they have and how much planting they've done before, ranging from, this is the number of trees, but anywhere from 10,000 trees to hundreds of millions of trees. They range in size, and they also range in the amount of scientific expertise that they have on staff. What we did find that was heartening was that we looked at how much they talked about local participation in the projects, and this shows that the dark blue is yes, the lighter blue is sort of vague, there was some information that was vague, or the blank white is no information. And that for the most part, they did talk about engaging local communities, which is better than this earlier Martin paper that was about 3 years ago, that people are moving, there's more accountability, at least thinking that they need to engage local groups. A lot of that was mostly in the implementing phase and slightly lower when you get at things like planning and then follow-up afterwards. And they do talk a lot about local benefits, a number of different, this is a word cloud of food security, education, income, ecosystem services that they'll get from that. So most group mentions engaging local communities and the benefits they will receive. On the other hand, what we found was they don't have a lot of very rigorous monitoring of what those communities actually gain from this involvement. So they would often say, we've helped this many families or this many farmers, but they don't necessarily know if it's really increased their income or what benefits they're actually, they're benefits. We were also really interested in the whole maintenance and monitoring, sort of this accountability, and how much these project longevity. And so we found about 70% provided information or something about monitoring. And this is actually a lot higher than in the past. Just 3 years earlier, the Martin paper had found that only 18% mentioned monitoring. About 41% reported some sort of a measure of tree survival, which was the most common measurements. They didn't report a lot of other data. And that survival ranged anywhere from 90 to 100%, but with a median of about 80%. So this is kind of a complicated figure, so I'll walk through it. So first of all, we looked at whether they had any sort of a maintenance or monitoring commitment and how long it was. And so that's on this axis. And so only a few organizations had commitments, at the time of 5 or 10 years. A lot of either had no long-term commitment that was clear or was pretty short. or they just said the locals were responsible for maintaining it without saying how they would actually support that. Then when you looked at the funding, and this is one of the big things, is like a lot of group organizations will say, we'll give you money to do the work, but then what's the long-term benefits to the landholder of doing that? In a lot of cases, there was no information provided. In some cases, a few cases in the dark blue, they did actually pay landowners, and or they said yes, there was funding. In other cases, they explicitly said they were paying it to locals. So there are some groups that are doing that. About 78%, and this was much higher than we thought, actually recognize certain drivers of deforestation and have actually thought about, like, and then a good chunk of those have actually discussed how they're addressing them. Many fewer discuss potential negative effects of reforestation. Most often they would mention the effect of not planting invasive species because of the effects of that. We also did an analysis of the organizations, and we found that organizations that had more past experience planting trees and more scientific staff or expertise, like if they had a scientific advisory board, they were more likely to follow some of the best practices recommendations that have come out. And then you're interested in this question about the cost split of where the money is going if you're donating, and about 30%, 33%, a third, only a third said how much money went to the intermediary organization versus the local organizations, and when they did, it was a wide range, but generally around 80%. So that was actually higher than what we thought. Only about 60% had in-country staff when they worked in other countries. So what we took from this whole analysis was that many organizations, there have been all these best practices, and not just the paper that Pedro and I had, but there's been about 3 or 4 different papers saying, like, we need to improve the work that's being done in tree growing organizations, but there's still a long way to go with transparency and accountability. And like I said, we would probably uncover more information if we actually went and interviewed every single organization, which we did not do. So another thing I wanted to mention, just work in my lab, here, is that is this sort of forest cover reversals. And I mentioned a little while ago that what we found is that there are quite a lot of these restored forests are not as permanent as we think. And so, Costa Rica gets a lot of press for being the area that has, has increased forest cover in the country, and Latin America has done so. But you also find that a lot of this area that's in secondary forest gets re-cleared. And this is this paper provided by student Late Reed a while back, and what they show is this is the forest patches persisting over time, and what he found was that after 40 to 50 years, only about 20% of that forest was still there. So one of the big questions from some of these forest reversals is, why are the farmers re-clearing their land? Because if we're going to set up, policies to try to minimize that, then we have to understand that. And so, I want to mention that Francis Joyce, who I know many of you guys know, is actually working on that right now. And what he's been doing is out actually going and interviewing landowners who have re-cleared their forests in 3 different regions in Costa Rica to figure out why they're doing that. Because if you understand that, then you can sort of think about what type of incentives you would be giving the landowners. And from my conversation from him, he's about 2/3 of the way done. There's a lot of different reasons that people are going and re-clearing land, but it raises some serious questions about kind of the permanence of some of these efforts. So stay tuned, and you'll have to get him to give a talk on that in about 6 months. So anyway, I'll stop there, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Yes?
So what often do you need to monitor the trees when you plant them?
Well, that's a good question. I think that if you're really, particularly for making carbon commitments and stuff like that, you should really be doing it on an ongoing basis. And a number of the carbon group, if you're getting carbon certified, a lot of those are 20 years. I would say for tree survival, different provides an opinion. I think that a minimum of 3 years is important, but you really have to, because that's the highest mortality. But if you're really trying to say that you're compensating, I think that really you need some sort of in perpetuity type monitoring. And like I said, most of the carbon requirements now are a minimum of 20. Yeah.
And that means giving maintenance to the surrounds, like around the
Pardon?
tree? Cutting the weeds and all around the
Oh,
tree?
no, are we talking monitoring or maintenance?
Both?
Okay, maintenance, Deborah and I were just talking about that this morning, because I don't know who Deborah, she works here on restoration here. That depends on the system you're in. Here, around here, and my experience, and we were talking about today, somewhere between probably 1 and 2 to 3 years is like for maintenance. The monitoring is, what I'm saying is that if you're using tree planting as a sort of compensation for biodiversity, or you're saying you're achieving these goals, we really need to be, I mean, it takes decades for forests to recover, and so that the monitoring should go on a lot longer than the maintenance.
Thank you.
Yes?
Speaking of monitoring, we've got our own little carbon offset program here, and one of the things that we're trying to figure out is how do you monitor without having to put more money into monitoring than actually restoring habitat. And so looking around at different possible tools to be able to do that with satellite images that even the people who are doing offsetting can look at over time. And then having backup for, okay, what if something does happen to that land, be able to say, okay, we've got this backup land that we've not had anybody else contribute to. But we're thinking about the possibility of using Restore. I'm not sure if they've got the tools to use it. I know you're familiar with Restore, but is there some kind of an open source tool or that we could be using so that we can do the monitoring?
I'm not a remote sensor, but there's a lot of stuff with Google Earth. And in fact, that's how Francis is looking at where the reversals are. And so a lot of people just use Google Earth to look at that. The Restore does have Restore has its problems. If you know where you're working, and they do have over time, they definitely have historic photographs, like aerial photography. The problem with Restore is that everything they claim to be a platform that is going to have all restoration globally, but it's completely user driven. And so if people report it, then it's on there, but there's a lot of groups, in a lot of the big groups, even like CIOT, Conservation International, are saying, we're not going to buy into Restore. So, but there are a lot of remote sensing tools, and I mean, a lot of people just use Google Earth or images over time to be able to look at that. And I do think that at scale, remote sensing is going to be the way to go with that. And they're getting a lot better algorithms for figuring out how much carbon. I mean, you're always going to need some ground truthing for that to figure out, in a given system, how much carbon there is. So, yes, Deb.
Karen, I'm interested in the payments that you were giving to the farmers. Were the payments for, was it worded to increase their efficiency in cattle management, or was it payment for restoration?
Is this in the Columbia example?
Yeah.
The Columbia example was a really interesting study. So what they were doing was they were paying the farmers to transition over. And what's interesting is a lot of these payments for environmental services programs are ongoing. What was interesting about this project that Alicia did was that the farmers got payments for 3 years to help offset the cost of transitioning the type of farming that they were doing, and they didn't get any payments afterwards. And she came in 10 years later, and that's a lot of these PES programs, they're really short-term monitoring, and she went in 10 years later and looked at both the diversity of, in the riparian forest, how well they were coming back. So a number of the practices, I didn't go into detail, they use in silvopastoral systems. First of all, they move the cows more often, and so there's fencing. So that's one of the costs. The other one is that they will do double fencing along the fence lines and then plant trees so that you can cattle graze at the same time you're increasing your live fences and stuff in those systems. They also are asking them to fence off the riparian system so they can regenerate. And so those are all kind of costly things. And then there is the providing seedlings part of it too. But so they give them payments that help them to do that type of work. And then she did this GIS study looking at farms with payments and without payments. It actually found that the tree cover had gone up on all farms, but that it had gone up more on the farms that had received payments. points. And so it's kind of transitioning over the system to those types of programs. And there's a lot of incentive in Columbia right now to try to transition to to those types of systems. They are more labor intensive, and that's kind of the challenge in transitioning them over. But she also did interviews with farmers of like why they transitioned, and it was actually interesting because a lot of them said that in addition to increasing productivity, it increased, it reduced variability, and they were concerned about climate change. And with that, by having these sort of more sustainable systems, they had actually seen more consistency in their production, and that was one of their motivations to do that, was to be involved, was because of that. So, and again, it gets to understanding like, why people are making these decisions, so you can design interventions that actually make sense for those. Yes?
Interested in tree species selected for planting, how various groups decide on what they're going to plant. It would seem to me that logically they're mainly interested in carbon, that you're going to plant trees that have high survival rate and they're fast growing, which tend to be early successional species. And is it your perception that generally they just throw in we're increasing biodiversity by growing these fast-growing early successional trees? Or are there organizations that take the biodiversity more seriously and think about planting a wider variety of species, some late successional species, or how this will evolve from the secondary forest into something more biodiverse?
So what, as I mentioned, the paper by Meredith Martin showed, and they did a survey of organizations with slightly different questions, but 3 years before us. Overwhelmingly, they are utilitarian species that are planted. So, and I've seen this too, as part of getting involved in this whole discussion. I've been on the advisory board for several NGOs now, and they asked me to screen like projects. And so a lot of the local groups are planting breadfruits, really popular one, mangoes, things like that. And so a lot of them are fruit trees, which makes sense because if you want farmers to maintain trees on their land, they're also timber valuable trees that they plant. And so those tend to be more what they plant. My own experience and my own research in like planting, farmers don't want to plant early successional tree species because they see them as kind of useless, like they're not. And the other thing from a carbon perspective is that things like, I don't know, Cecropia or some of the mellostomes or things that grow really fast, Heliocarpus, they have really low density wood, so there's a trade-off in the carbon sequestration realm because even if you have a slower tree, if it has more dense wood, then so it's sort of a trade-off. But there's a lot of it is dictated by what is socially acceptable. I found in the area of what they're using. If they're doing it for more, what I think the problem is that a lot of people they'll tell their donors we're increasing biodiversity. In fact, most groups are not planting a wide diversity of trees. And I would say that the percentage of people who are actually doing tree planting or tree growing for restoration is a relatively small percentage. I mean, I think around here it's probably much higher. But in general, a lot of the large-scale stuff that's being done is being done because landowners value those trees, and so those are going to be trees that they see some potential to at some point log, or that they see as fruit trees or things like that. So, and that gets down to this whole thing when these papers come out that say, oh, there's all this degraded land globally, and we can plant trees everywhere. Yes, but if you're going to really do trees for biodiversity, you need to have a long-term, it's going to make a lot more sense when you have long-term protection, or you have landowners who are at the size that they can afford to put a certain part of their land aside for biodiversity, and then use another amount for production and things like that. So there's this balance. That's what I've observed. But I don't know, do you have another?
No, that's it. We were talking today, like here we even have if somebody would just do carbon sequestration, but that would.
Yeah, and some of the carbon sequestration ones, they're just doing, eucalyptus or not fast growing. I mean, if you want to grow up trees fast, forget the early successional, grow eucalyptus, or mulina, or one of those trees that grows really fast. Now, they don't necessarily have very dense wood, but yeah. And it is interesting. Let me put the slide in here. Oh, I'm going to show Deb this. We were talking about eucalyptus today. I realized I had these slides. This is work from, just a little off topic here, about Pedro's work in Brazil. This is an area, this was a eucalyptus stand in Brazil. It's owned by, what's it called? They're one of the large eucalyptus, Brazil is the largest producer of paper pulp, and they do a lot of that with eucalyptus. And when they went in, this whole national park was a former eucalyptus plantation, and they girdled it, and that's all native stuff that's coming up underneath it, so it's pretty amazing. So Pedro's been doing this really interesting research with the eucalyptus companies on planting strips, where you plant strips of eucalyptus and then strips of native species. And the idea is that you log these out after a few years, the eucalyptus, that helps pay for the cost of restoration, and then you have native species. And so it looks something so you end up with this area, but you can see here, these are native trees that are planted at the same time as eucalyptus, and it's really obvious how much taller the eucalyptus are. And Deb and I were talking about this today. I was horrified when I started working with him in Brazil, because in California, nothing grows under eucalyptus, but in that particular system, it seems to work quite well. And once the eucalyptus are logged out, they don't seem to grow back that much, and they don't have a huge problem spreading. So I think it's a really interesting way of thinking about a solution of how do you sort of pay for restoration. And he's always thinking about how do we do restoration at scale in a way that's economical. So. Yes.
Follow up on that. I've noticed here, this is very specific to this zone, but plantations, after the trees were maybe 20 years old, they were tall enough that birds like toucans and bellbirds and quetzals and guans would use those trees to perch in after having dining on various agricultural fields. And the result is that you have an understory coming up of these agricultural. So it's an interesting way to successfully reproduce those. But
So these aren't eucalyptus they're perching on? They're perching on eucalyptus?
what's that?
I didn't hear, you were saying that they're perching on eucalyptus?
No, not eucalyptus.
Oh.
No, we were planting a mix of species.
Yeah.
But they had to be a certain height before.
Yeah, and we were talking about that today too. Its structure is huge. And my research project in southern Costa Rica, which I didn't talk much about, what we've been testing for the last 20 years is the idea of planting patches of trees that then, rather than planting the whole area with trees, that then attract birds and bats to bring in other species. Because ultimately in a tropical forest like this, you're not going to plant every tree species. So what you want to do is catalyze the successional process. And so in the project in southern Costa Rica, we actually planted only 4 species, 2 of which are Inga edulis and Erythrina peruviana, which are what people plant in our coffee, shade trees. And they actually, it seems like they work quite well in attracting the birds and the bats, shading out the grasses. And what's worked really well in our system is that the Inga edulis, the 2 nitrogen-fixing species, they've actually died after about 10 years. And so they're just dropping out of the system. And that gets back to my whole point about growing trees, is that people get really, really fixated. They want to know, where can I plant trees? I'm going to go put a shovel, I'm going to dig in a hole. And really what we need to be doing is thinking about how do we accelerate the recovery process. And so that's exactly what you're saying. And that's where more and more, I do see this with the intermediary organizations, that they're starting to realize that natural regeneration or assisted natural regeneration, maybe I call it spatially patterned planting. You plant certain places and then you allow that to attract other species. That makes a lot of sense. Other questions? Yeah.
It's not a question, it's more of a comment. I just wanted to say that I really appreciate the consideration of the different subtleties of sites and local relevancies and local populations and concerns. And I think that also, as a manager of a gigantic chunk of land, some of which we now have purchased new areas and we have the potential to reforest, and people always want to know, what are you going to do with it? And just that assumption that we have to do something with it, and it's so refreshing to see the possibility that maybe we don't necessarily have to do anything with it, that we can to naturally regenerate or help it along in some ways. And I appreciate
Well, an interesting thing on that one, and I have a paper from so in southern Costa Rica, my project that we have 3 treatments. One is natural regeneration, one is planting islands of trees, and the other one is planting the whole area with trees. The whole time with only 4 species, so they have to catalyze recovery. But I did this one paper a couple of years ago where we looked at, and we replicated the whole experiment at 15 different sites. And one of the things we started realizing was that the sites, after about 2 years, we had this one site, and there were so many mellostones out there, and I thought, oh my gosh, we are going to be out there monitoring. Like, the next year, all our sites are going to look like this. And they never did. And so it was sort of an observation that the same sites that regenerated early on continue to accrue more seedlings over time. And so I did this analysis where we looked at how we could, the other thing you see in our sites is a huge amount of variation across the landscape, and how do you predict that variation? Because if you can predict that variation, then you can tell land managers, like, this is what you should do. And, we've looked at soil nutrients, and we've looked at soil compaction, and we've looked at mycorrhizal and all sorts of things. And for the natural recruitment, the biggest predictor is after a year and a half, how many recruits you have predicts it like 10 years down the line. And so that's my biggest advice that I tell people is, if you don't have to plant next year, give it 2 or 3 years and see what comes in. Because if stuff starts to come in within a couple of years, then you probably don't need to plant, or you can selectively plant species that aren't coming in. In contrast, we have some other sites with Pennisetum purpureum, which is a really tall grass, or other grasses, and they look exactly the same today as they did 19 years ago. When Deb and I were out this morning, it was like, there were a couple of purples, we're like, yep, that looks exactly the way it did before, And so that's my biggest advice on that one, is just kind of give it a little time. But if after 3 or 4 years it hasn't changed, then you probably do need to, But it's the same stuff like Dan Jensen was doing up in Guanacaste. They spent a bunch of money planting trees in the early years of the Santa Rosa project, and then realized that the money was way better spent on fire patrols than it was on actually planting trees, because in that system there's a lot more wind dispersed species, and in dry forest systems there's also a lot more resprouting. And so if you have a lot, which we don't have in these moisture systems as much, so then maybe you don't need to plant trees as much, or you plant the trees. We find, and I'm sure you guys do too, huge dispersal limitations. So anything with large seeds just doesn't come in unless there's a really pretty nearby seed source, which doesn't necessarily have to be in the remnant forest. Sometimes they're left in the landscape too, but so bringing larger seed species into it is pretty important. Yes?
So you mentioned a bit on the social acceptability and such, but I was curious on how has traditional ecological knowledge informed much of the large-scale tree planting projects here in Costa Rica?
That's a really good question. Not as much as it should. And I know even in my own science, I sort of embarrassingly will tell you that I go out there and study stuff, and I'll realize something, and then I have some really great Costa Rican field assistants who are, one of whom used to be a farmer, and he'd be like, yeah, Karen, we kind of already knew that, we knew this sort of stuff, and I'm like, okay, I feel kind of stupid now. And I think that's something I don't see that much, I haven't seen in the restoration field, but sort of more broadly. In the restoration field, there's been a really increased knowledge and recognition in the last 5 to 10 years of different forms of knowledge, and not just indigenous knowledge, but also just local knowledge of people who are on the land, and the importance of being involved in that. And so I can't speak for all the projects in Costa Rica because I don't know. I don't know. How do you feel about who's
Lorenzo.
Yeah, we don't have here in Costa Rica the indigenous. There is some indigenous culture, but not as much as I think in some other countries where they've not been exterminated as much as has happened here. But I think that recognizing that, and that's been one of the things, like in Brazil, they've been developing a lot of seed collector networks and really engaging those local communities, and that's what's going to need to happen to scale up. And so In my own experience, I don't think there has been enough recognition of local and indigenous knowledge, and I think it's really key because to make, and it's also just knowing not just like what works ecologically, but what works socially, like what's going to be acceptable to people and whether they would even consider adopting certain types of practices too. Yes.
Earlier you were talking about how a lot of these organizations focus more on land that's not super viable for like high intensity agriculture and stuff like that. But just in terms of like biodiversity and whatnot, like what about the ecosystems that we prefer, like that happen where the agriculture value to the land is really high? You know what I mean? Are there any like?
Well, I think it's kind of even on the landscape. Like when I started my project in southern Costa Rica, we worked on farmers' lands, and you would go out, and it's a 10-hectare property. And I could tell you, like you walk around the property and say we need 1 hectare. You know exactly which 1 hectare they were going to give us. It was the one with a slope like that, that, like those sorts of things. And is the tree species composition that different on that land versus the flat land? You're still in the same ecosystem. And so I agree with you, like floodplain forests. I work in California on floodplain forest restoration, which have been completely decimated because they are flat. You have silt in the land, it's a flood zone. And so in those cases, you do have to, in that case, what they've done on the Sacramento River where I work is the land that's the most viable there is the land closest to the river because it floods often enough that it's not as viable for crops. And so it's sort of figuring out in the system which is the least viable. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't try to do that. It's just from a practical standpoint of land acquisition and getting landowners to cooperate and to maintain it long term. I think it's good to think strategically about which places you're not going to be as in heavy competition with prime agriculture. In the United States, politically, it's extremely difficult to try to buy prime agricultural farmland. And so it's kind of figuring out how you can work around that system. So I'm not saying that's ideal, it's more of a practical how it's do. So. Other questions? Yeah.
I'm very sorry I couldn't make it for the presentation, but I would like to make a common question. In relation specifically to the situation in Costa Rica, I think we clearly have big areas that have been protected and that will be protected probably forever. And then we have, on the other extreme, all the, let's say, productive land on many different activities. But then we have an in-between, which is, let's say, fairly big areas of land, not all as one patch, but distributed everywhere in Costa Rica. But, a portion of land that in the past was economically feasible with certain activities, possibly the most common, beef cattle. There's quite a bit of that land in Costa Rica now that brings a big question mark for the owner. What should I do with this land? I don't have the resources to just let it regenerate and be protected area. I don't have the resources to make a big investment in order to start a new activity that might require research or money or technical assistance. But quite a bit of that land could go into, let's say, commercial reforestation as a way to create some income in the mid-long term without too much of a big investment. It's also wood that maybe one way or the other diminishes the pressure on getting wood from more precious land. So it becomes some way, Costa Rica demands quite a bit of wood, and teak or pochote or laurel or are possibilities for these farmers. And it's not, in many cases, it's not huge portions of land, but it's small, mid-sized farms that have seen in reforesting a possible way of creating benefits, especially for the following generation. Excuse me if you have already commented about this, but I just wanted to kind of put this on the table as something that, from my point of view, is quite a bit of the situation in Costa Rica.
Yeah, and
this land in between, and it's not it doesn't have to do with forest patches, which I think more and more are being protected, but it's what used to be a coffee plantation that doesn't work anymore, or a grassland that used to be feasible with beef cattle, but it's not so much now.
yeah, and I talked about that
Sorry,
people
yeah.
people plant trees for different reasons. I'm a restoration ecologist, so I think a lot about how to restore forests. But absolutely, there's a whole different series of ways you plant trees. And monoculture plantations or mixed species plantations for timber absolutely have their role. And in many ways, yes, the first thing I say, and I did say this, is protect the existing forest first. And so whatever we can do to do that makes total sense, and I completely agree. The question is where is it actually feasible? And like I said, sort of in response to one of the last questions, it's easier to do plantation forestry on some of the more level lands and the lowlands where you can actually get in there. I mean, a lot of the type that, the landscape that I work in southern Costa Rica is very similar to here, where it is hard on some of these steep slopes to actually do commercially viable timber. But absolutely planting trees, and a lot of farmers do want certain species, so they even if it's not commercial, just so they have the resource on their land to have the wood to use, to build something later on. And that has its role too. It's just, my point too is that there are trade-offs, because if you're planting land for timber, then that land is not, ultimately those trees are going to be cut down, so they are, depending on what the end of the wood is, they probably aren't sequestering carbon and they aren't conserving biodiversity. And so it's deciding, what are your priorities? And they all play a role. It's just being clear on what you're trying to do and then figuring out a way to do it. So I agree with you. I don't see what you're saying happening a lot, and it probably could happen a lot more. What I think some of the re-clearing that's happening has to do with changes in agricultural products. I know in southern Costa Rica went all out of coffee, and now the coffee prices are going up, and so people are partly re-clearing for changes in agricultural lands. There's also, the other problem with natural regeneration is that farmers don't see the value to the land of that. It's like, it's messy. You don't show that you own it. And one of the hardest things we had in our study in Costa Rica, in southern Costa Rica, was like people going like, why aren't you planting trees everywhere? Why do you allow for that? And so there's a bunch of social obstacles to that sort of thing. So that's where planting trees that are wood valuable, particularly on smallholder properties, would make a lot of sense, because then they see some value to that tree planting. Absolutely. Okay. Any other question, or you just?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm sure you could talk for the rest of the day about this, but I was just wondering if you could just talk a little bit about the land in the South Pacific, southern Costa Rica you were talking about, or like insights you gained from that. Like if I was going to go buy like 100 hectares of like clear cut pasture, and what could I do to turn it into a forest?
What can you do to interpret for us?
Yeah, like what insights have you gained from your?
Well, what we found in our work is that this whole idea of planting patches of trees actually seems to work pretty well. And so rather than having to plant the entire area, that the patches of trees tend to attract the birds and the bats and shade out the grasses. And so we've looked at that, and then we've looked quite a bit at like how big those patches. But my sort of advice is, first of all, see how much natural regeneration happens. Second of all, go and plant in areas that are regenerating more slowly, and then you can attract them. And the other thing is how well the forest regenerates depends on where there are seed sources in the landscape. And so we did a lot of work looking to begin with at like the amount of forest cover in the landscape, which isn't necessarily the best predictor. A better predictor is like where the seed sources are, and sometimes there's there'll be like an oak or some really large seeded tree species right out in the middle of the agricultural landscape, and so we find that there is a really big correlation with that. I mean, obviously in general, being near, having some remnant forest nearby is really, really helpful in doing that. So And I mean, there's people around here who are pretty knowledgeable about, different species that work. And I do think that sort of the local knowledge is talking to the people where you are and figuring out which species are going to make the most sense for what species are going to make the most sense for the specific conditions you have on your site. And sometimes that's a bit of trial and error to figure that out. Cool, well thanks, seems like a lot of good questions. I'm here, if anybody else has any other questions, you can come up and ask me individually. But I appreciate the active exchange of ideas, because that's much more fun than talking to the audience. So anyway, so yeah, thanks a lot.